Welcome to this remote episode of the Flex Work podcast. Today we have a very interesting guest. Collier, I want to jump right in because I think we're going to have a ton to talk about today.
Outside of tech support?
As we already have before we got started. This podcast is brought to you by No Money by DJI. I want to jump right in and talk about your childhood. I did a little research and learned a little about you, and your childhood is definitely different than 99.9 whatever percent of I'd say of the world. For people that don't know your backstory, kind of give it to us as briefly or in depth as you like.
I'm going to try to give it to. I have a tendency to be very verbose, so I'm going to try to be really succinct in this. When I was 11 years old, my father murdered my mother, and no one believed me except for one detective. And between myself and this detective, we solved my mother's murder in 25 days. They ended up digging my mother's body up from underneath a house that my father had purchased in another state in Pennsylvania. And I was abandoned by both sides of my family. Mother's side because I look like my father. Father's side because they said I put him in jail. And I went into the foster care system. And then I was eventually adopted about a year into the whole ordeal. And so that is the sort of lens at which shaped my childhood. Now, sort of taking that back a little bit, I grew up with what I thought was a normal childhood, like I think a lot of us didn't do, right? But really, I was born in Philadelphia. I was raised in Virginia, and then we moved from Virginia to Ohio when I was around 5 years old. And it was when we got to this small town, Mansfield, that I started to sort of notice a shift in my parents' dynamic. My father, for just put it just how it is a psychopath. He was very abusive to my mother and I growing up. He, and then obviously committing the murder. He is still incarcerated to this day. So I testified at trial, put him in prison, and he's still incarcerated to this day. I then, and I think we're going to talk about this in the show here, but I then spent the rest of my life, and still do to this day, trying to unravel how all of this happened, but also use it as fuel to not only, help heal myself, but benefit others from my experience. So that led me to be a filmmaker.
And I want to, there are a few things in there. I mean, obviously that's, it's right out of a true crime, Netflix series. And I think some of the details of the story, this was early 90s, right? Yeah. So this is early 90s. So there's, advancements in some technology, but I mean, some of these things, like the fact that there was another house and it was hundreds of miles away from your house. I mean, how does all this come together in terms of you working with this detective and getting this solved?
Sure. So what had happened so this murder took place on New Year's Eve, and I had been woken up. So I kissed my mother goodnight, New Year's, December 30th, wake up in the middle of the night, 3:18-ish in the morning, to the sound of two loud thuds about 60 seconds apart. And I can hear my father's voice. And about 2 months prior to this, my mother had said something to me. My parents were getting a divorce because my father was a chronic womanizer. And finally he had introduced me to one of his girlfriends, and that was like the line in the sand that you don't cross with my mother, because she knew about all of his affairs, but I never knew about this. And once he involved me, that was like it. So they were getting a divorce, and my mother had said to me, she was kind of downtrodden. This is around, like I said, around Thanksgiving of that year. And she told me, she said, "Collier, I would never leave you. If anything ever happened to me, I want you to know that your father had probably had me killed." And I was like, "Of course, Mommy, like there's no way that would ever happen." And
which is also, I mean, it has to be a crazy thing for an 11-year-old to hear from their mother.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, when I hear these thuds and I hear my father muttering, I'm thinking back to that conversation, and I'm laying in my bed, sort of rationalizing, okay, I was an asthmatic little kid. My father's 6'3", at that time, 230 pounds. I'm a little asthmatic kid. And I'm thinking, do I do I get up? Okay, that's not going to work out well. What am I going to do? I'm going to just freeze here. And everything inside me is just like, just stay put. And I heard my father's footsteps walk down the hall. Now, I was someone who slept with his door open. So I'm laying there and I'm looking out of my peripheral vision, and I see my father's feet land in my doorway, and they just stay there. And everything inside me is screaming, "Don't look up." And I firmly, I know that if I had just kind of turned my head and looked up, I would not be sitting here today, because it's nothing to make the hole a little bit bigger and say she left with the kid. So the next morning I'd rushed to her bedroom and was looking for blood and all these things. And I came downstairs and I confronted my father. I didn't find any blood. And, obviously my mother's gone. I said, "Where is my mother?" And he said, "Mommy took a little vacation, Collier." And that's that moment where looking at my father, like, oh, it's game on, and at that moment, I didn't know that he had killed her, but I knew he had done something to her. And I was like, okay. And then he starts going into this whole thing about, we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call the FBI. And I'm thinking, I live in a small town, Ohio. They're FBI. Like, come on.
Right.
And he goes about his day. And so I immediately, and one of the things that I had done is when my mother told me that, I wrote down all of her friends' names and phone numbers, and I hid them in a stuffed Garfield in my room. So I grabbed the cordless telephone. I ran upstairs. And by the way, at this time, my grandmother had just come, who was my father's mother, who was like almost like my mother's mom, because they just had this amazing relationship. And she's telling me, don't you call the police, Collier. Don't you do that. And you know what your father said. And I'm like, I'm a disobedient little kid, still a disobedient adult. And I'm a filmmaker. I mean, come on. And I grab a cordless phone. I go and grab that list, and I lock myself in the bathroom. I start calling all the names on the list. And I told them what happened. And I said, you need to call the police, because I can't call the police. Police show up, and I'm trying to get away, like separated from my grandmother's apoplectic. And I'm trying to like walk around the house and try to like talk to them, but I can't because my grandmother's right there. And I said to them, like, I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him, because that's what my mother used to say. And he looks at me like I'm a kid, right? What had happened is there was a missing persons report filed, but like the police weren't doing anything. My father was a doctor, in a small town community. And so that was a thing. So they're not going to go after a doctor. And what had happened was, by the grace of God, this detective named Lieutenant David Messmore came to the house a couple of days later. And when my grandmother let him in, and then she went to call my father, my mother used to tell me about these moments in life, because she would talk about carousel horses growing up in Philadelphia, and you'd ride the carousel and you'd try to grab the brass ring to win the prize. She said, always grab the brass ring in life, Collier. And I knew that when my grandmother left me alone with a cop, that this was the moment that I could talk to him. And I said, give me your card. I go back to school in a couple of days. I will call you. My mother would never leave me. Something has happened to her. And he was like, okay, this isn't a normal little kid. So during that 25 days, like, he came to the school, I told him everything. And I said, look, I'm going to go back to my house. And when my father's gone and my grandmother's downstairs making dinner, I'm going to pull out the bookshelves out of our crawl space and look for my mother's body. I'm going to look for her purse. I'm going to look for all these things. I started gathering evidence against my father. He had all these cuts on his hands. He had bruises. He asked me to like rub Bengay on his shoulders because he was sore one night. I mean, I'm just making note after note. And every night his divorce attorney is there. But the biggest key piece of evidence was about halfway through the month of January that year. So this is now 1990. And he asked me if I wanted to go to his office to pick up some paperwork. I'm like, of course, I'm not letting him out of my sight. Because mind you, every day I'm calling the police I'm calling Detective Messmore from school. I'm not doing any schoolwork. I'm calling Messmore. And we stop at this gas station, and he goes into the gas station. I'm watching him through the windshield. I start rummaging through his car, and I open up his center console in his truck. And I find two photographs. One is of his girlfriend and her two kids sitting in front of a fireplace that's wrapped in plastic. And the second one is of a house that I've never seen before. And that's when I told them, I was like, there's a house and his girlfriend is in that house with her kids, and something is up. And that ended up sort of being the impetus for them now finding this house. And and again, this whole thing unraveled and began to unravel. And in that time, I started noticing my father was under more and more duress when he would come home. This is a very violent man that I grew up with, but his behavior had changed since he had committed the murder. And during this time, he was becoming very passive. He didn't want to, like, he used to be somebody who loved violence and all these things. And I was playing a video game, a violent, Street Fighter game on my Nintendo. And he was like, "What is this game? This is very violent." I'm like, "Who are you?" Like, he just started changing. Right. And, but he said to me, this was around January 21st. And he said to me, he goes, "I know it's been really difficult on you that mommy has left us." Cause every night he would talk about at dinner how my mother had left the whole family in such a state and where she could be off to and where she'd be, like, if she's gone on a trip somewhere. It's crazy, right? He's a psychopath. So he says to me, "I have a medical conference in Florida, and I think we should go on this father and son trip because I know it's been really hard not having your mother around." And it was at that moment that I knew that I was not coming back from Florida, because most of these we would go every year to these medical conventions, but they weren't until the springtime because it was centered around spring break and it was just right after Christmas. So I knew something was fishy, and I knew I wasn't coming back because he was. Every night Dave Messmore is coming to the house to talk to him, and his lawyer's like saying, "No, you're not talking to my client." And I'm seeing Dave at the door, and we just got done talking hours before at my school. So I knew the heat was on. And so Children's Services popped me out of the home on January 24th. And then January 25th is when they found her body, and they arrested my father. And he has been in custody ever since.
Now, it's interesting to hear you tell the story all these years later. What was your emotional state as you're going through this, 3-week period? Like, when you're telling the story now, it almost feels like exciting in a way, like you're like you were part of the detective squad to get him. I mean, was that something that you wanted to do, or was it all just out of pain?
No, I mean, so, and this is something I talk about a lot with people who go through really extreme trauma. One of the things that I often think that really leads you through that trauma is being of action, and it's that force of action and being proactive in what is going on. Like, look, I am very emotional about it, and I cry a lot about it, and I've cried before, and even when they told me that she was dead and they had found her body, I was crying, and I was very upset because I still had this little glimmer of hope that I might be wrong, that I was kind of like gaslighting myself that all this had happened. But I was absolutely 100% determined to find out what happened to my mother. Like, nobody was going to stop me. I'm here in Mansfield now. My father is up for parole this year. I'm having to deal with that. I just saw Detective Messmore, and he was just even saying, like, you were just this like determined little kid that was, like just a tenacity that you weren't taking no for an answer. You were going to find out what happened to your mother. And that was being in action with that, I think, is really what helped. I mean, look, it doesn't take pain away or doesn't do anything. And it's not exciting. It's awful. It's horrible. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. But being able to, because when Dave started listening to me, I mean, that was such a relief because I know I'm not crazy. And then when they end up finding her and they arrest my father, I know I'm not crazy, even though it sucks because this is my mother who was just murdered, who was my most important person in my life that I spent the majority of my time with. And my father has killed her. So my whole family is done, done. Everything that I know up until those 11 and a half, almost 12 years at that point was gone. And again, this is not something I would wish upon anybody because it sucks.
Now,
yeah.
Yeah, you bring up your father was up for parole this year, and I know obviously that's why you've been in the news lately, and the stories kind of come back to life. You have a relationship with him, and I use the word relationship as loosely as you would like, and you can kind of get into that. But ultimately, what are your feelings there? Do you want to see him paroled? What happens with the two of you if he gets paroled? I mean, what does that kind of look like for you right now?
Well, I'm still sort of stewing on my decision with that, but he's been up for parole 2 other times. Um, you know, really, I made a film called A Murder in Mansfield, and when I left that room in the film, like that's the last time I saw him until very recently because I had to deal with him again. And you know, for a long time, I mean, again, my father's a psychopath. This is not somebody who exhibits normal feelings or behaviors that we respond to, or emotional responses. Like they can't even fake emotions. It's very strange and very eerie. It's just very cold and calculated. Everything centers around them, what you can do for them, what they can use you for. It's very predatory, and it's and very insidious and very difficult to recognize. So I think over the years, I made the film. I make I've made podcasts about this. I have a show on YouTube. I talk about, trauma and all of these things. I have interviewed other survivors of violent crime, people who've been through extraordinary circumstances like myself. I think the one thing that is in common is this, this survivor mentality, but also this, tenacity to live, but also this really deep-seated desire to understand and try to comprehend the incomprehensible, right? I think a lot of times we as human beings need to, for whatever reason, we're natural empaths, and we want to understand the complexities of not only the world around us, but those that are around us as well. So for years, even though I knew my father was a horrible person, I wanted to figure out, like, okay, well, first of all, I'm his son. So I live under the stigma of, like, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. People talk about it all the time. I'm ostracized because of it. There is, and that was one of my reasons for leaving Ohio and moving to Los Angeles at a very young age, because I wanted to just, go where the sun is bright and there's the beach and people make movies and that seems like a good life to me, But I always had this burning desire it wasn't, I had already, I made a decision very early on in my life to forgive my father, which is difficult for a lot of people to understand, unless you understand that forgiveness is not about them, it's about you, and you just saying this no longer has power over me and his behavior and who he was. But I think in the years since developing, content around this, making the film, I did a lot of research and a lot of conversations with a lot of people that have dealt with people like this and really understand the mentality that these people have. I remember when I left that room, I realized that, like, okay, because I had had a relationship with my father for decades, and my father for decades had blamed me for his incarceration and said that he never killed my mother and that I was manipulated by police, that I made up the whole story, not realizing or recognizing that the only reason police were involved was because of me, because of what I heard and because of his actions and his behaviors. So, it's one of those things, but it is very common when dealing with people like this. And when you go through trauma, you want to have this understanding of, like, okay, why did this happen? Books like, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning or Elie Wiesel's Night, and these are Holocaust survivors, of possibly the worst possible human conditions imaginable, but you find material like that and you find you have a lot in common with people like that when you go through something that's this horrific, right? And, sitting across from him and realizing, okay, I think the biggest thing for me, the challenge was, in that relationship, I spent so many years, decades, to finally realize I'm not that person. I'm my mother's son. I'm this loving, caring, kind person. I wake up every day, put my feet on the ground. I go, oh, this life is amazing. Do I have my dark moments and bad moments? Of course. And we all do, right? But I am a genuinely happy person. And it takes a certain amount of tenacity and fortitude, or whatever, hyperbolic sort of vocabulary what you want to use to describe it, but you really have to have this mentality that this isn't going to snuff out your light. Remember when I made the film? I moved to Santa Monica during the pandemic, and I remember, whispers got around the building. They're like, "Okay, we know he has a movie," and this. And then somebody asked me, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I made this movie. It's Murder. Yeah, I'll send you a link, whatever." I remember I was walking I have a little Chihuahua. I was walking my Chihuahua out front, and one of my neighbors came out. He was just like staring at me, not in like a weird way, but just kind of staring like he didn't know what to say. And I was like, "Hey, what's up, Jerry?" And he's like, "So I watched your movie last night." And I was like, "Oh yeah, what did you think?" And he goes, "Man, how you are not underneath a bridge with a needle in your arm in East LA is beyond me, or huddled up in the corner of your room just muttering to yourself." He's like, "If you were, I wouldn't blame you." It's like, I don't know where that comes from, but man, it's pretty special. And he's like, and it's really powerful to see you like walking around and just being a nice person and not begrudging the world. Now, to me, that just kind of comes second nature, because it's just well, like, what are the other options? Like, I want a nice life. I don't want to hate people or think the world owes me something,
or live under the bridge in East LA.
Yeah, or live under a bridge in East LA, and and look, I mean, I say that also with there's a very, I want your audience to know there's a very serious degree of compassion where I make that statement, but there are people that are very seriously affected by all kinds of trauma in this world. A lot of it, unfortunately, sexual trauma as children that are abused. No one listens to them. The detective doesn't show up. They don't get justice for themselves or for their family member or for their loved ones, and it breaks them. And that is a very real thing. And it happens. And while I'm here to say that there are choices that you can make that can be different from things, you have to have a lot of compassion for people that go through something like that then fall into these real bad pits of despair. But that's why I do what I do. And I talk about what I talk about to show people like, hey, there's a better way. You know what I mean? Not to sound magnanimous about it, but like, I think it's very important that people understand that, and that also people recognize that it's challenging. And if people are struggling with that, reach out for help. Like,
yeah, I think coming into this, the one question I wanted to ask you, because obviously a lot of the facts are out there. You can watch a movie, but the thing that kind of got me the most is sort of looking at your childhood after this happened, and what is it in that block between ages 11 and 20 that pushes you in what we'll just call the right direction? Like, things only got worse for you after, right? There's this moment, there's this one night, then there's this 3 weeks where going through the thing, then there's this trial that takes time, and then it got worse again. Then two sides of your family abandon you, you end up in foster care. Like, the story is not trending up at any point here, but yet somehow you turn this whole thing around. Like, what is it that I guess your teenage years, let's call it, that kind of for you kept you on the the straight and narrow?
I mean, I think first of all, it stems from the person that my mother was. Then it sort of melds into seeing the other people around me, the family members or the people that sort of surrounded the case, and just how solipsistic they were. This was a very big trial. This is like the second largest murder trial in Ohio history. It's a lot of fanfare. A lot of people wanted to be known about it. I mean, I shudder to think about if this had happened a few years later, or even like now, what it would be. It would be TikTok. It would be crazy. It would be on steroids, But even in that time, the people that were sort of grasping at straws to be a part of it, and trust me, like, it's, this is one of my biggest things with true crime. content that is created. It's like anything with your life that you can do that doesn't involve murders or abusive situations or things that were, life should be about happy endings and things like that. And in a lot of ways, there is a happy ending to the story, which is I'm still here and I'm a functional adult and I'm, sharing my story in a positive way. Right. And I live on for my mother. But, also, something my adopted father, George Ziegler told me, who's sitting mere steps away from here, probably can't hear me though. He doesn't have hearing aids in, but he was one of those people that was just like, look, was it all roses? And no, it wasn't. It's a difficult upbringing. It's difficult to bring up a child, that you adopt into a home after being in foster care, after dealing with all this stuff. Right. I remember he said something to me once and he's like, you're not a victim. Like, the world is full of victims. You're not a victim. And I never had that victim mentality, but it's like always something that stuck in my head of like, you still have a choice. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in the undertow. And I'm not here to sit here and be like, I'm some stellar, citizen, but, I chose the right side of all of this, I think. And, I'm an artist, so a filmmaker, I wouldn't say that's a great career for anyone to get into nowadays, but, finding creative outlets for me was a big, big thing. I'm a musician. I went to music school. I'm a classically trained singer. And then I moved to Hollywood and moved to Hollywood, or Los Angeles because I wanted to be in a place where no one knew who I was, where I could build a life that was based upon me and not my circumstance. Like nobody knew anything about me. So when I made this movie with a 2-time Oscar winner and then it's out there and then my friends, directors I worked with, actors or people that I just knew in the business are like, dude, I just saw you on some movie. What is this? Like I worked with you. I did 3 seasons of television with you, man. Like, how did I not know this was your story? I was like, well, because I don't really talk about it. You know what I mean? And until I was ready to like do something with it, but I became a filmmaker to tell that story. That was it. That was the impetus for me. Like, I'm going to do something creative with this. And that's what's going to propel me forward. And always with my father, especially, being incarcerated, I always knew I was going to need his cooperation on some level, which he's in the film and thought I was making a film to help him get out of prison. I didn't tell him that, but he thought so. So there's a lot with that. But again, I think if I was to pinpoint it, it's just that tenacity that was in myself, and then really finding those creative outlets and just leading a purpose-driven life of just, this is what you want, because it really is. It's so easy to get caught up in the undertow, man. It really is.
What do you, as you kind of look forward, what do you want? Obviously you made the film. I don't know if there's more to be done with it. If Netflix is knocking, I mean, how far do you want to take this story? I mean, do you want it to define you for forever? Do you feel like it already does? Do you want to just move on from it at some point?
Well, that's very interesting you say that because, again, I never wanted it to be this thing, but I needed to do something with it. But then I just sort of embraced it. But again, my message is less about like, let's talk about what happened to me and be like, more like, how can you, listener, audience member, person struggling with whatever it is, how can you take from what I've been through and apply it to your own life? And how can you learn from that so you don't ever have to go through that? And then on the flip side, for people that have been through this serious trauma, now, thank God, a lot of people that reach out to me do not have stories like me, and that's a blessing. But when they do have stories that are really dark, they hear my story or they see it on channels like Soft White Underbelly, or, they see the film. I had a kid whose dad killed his mom. This was a few years ago. It was on the West Coast, and this is why I wanted to tell the story to begin with, for moments like this. Because for me, like growing up, like I always wanted to know, like, okay, I don't know if we can cuss on this podcast, but who's been through the real shit and who can I learn from, and there's no YouTube back then. There's no podcast. There's no, even books on tape really, so I was always like hungry for like, who could I learn from, right? And I remember that in my darkest hours and during all of this, like if I could have just spoken to somebody or just heard someone tell this story, but like, you're going to be okay. So this kid, his dad had killed his mom, but it was a totally different circumstance. There was, he had a brain disease. The mom was terminally ill. He had imagined something. Anyways, it was horrible. Regardless, it was horrible. And, the dad was going to go on trial for like manslaughter or what have you. But the kid was, he was in high school, just graduating or whatever. And he had either had a younger brother or an older brother. I can't remember which, but he said to me, he goes, on this morning, I was making plans to end my life. And I had bought the means to do that. And I just turned on my television, my Fire TV, and up on Amazon popped your movie. And I read the thing and I said, oh my God. And I watched your movie and I'm still here because of it. He's like, I didn't think anybody had a story like me. And here you had one that was worse. And I was like, if this guy can do it, so can I. That is what I want.
Hearing what, the story that you just told about how you can touch somebody through a film, as a filmmaker, that's something that I've gone through. I mean, the stuff that I've done is to say is more lighthearted. I don't know if there's a larger understatement. My first feature was about Back to the Future. I mean, it couldn't be more, fun and light. And, but when you get comments from people, I mean, that's sort of like the thing as a filmmaker, right? Like that's, we share a lot of stuff. I was listening to you tell. I was a singer in a band for many years, and it's just that thing, like when that one stranger comes up to you and they're like, "Oh, I heard your song on Spotify," or like, or when you get off stage, and music and film, it's very different, but then very similar in terms of like that kind of reaction, the way it touches you. And I'm working on a film now about eating healthy, right? So.
Yeah.
Ultimately, my hope is almost that somebody will find me down the road and write me an email and be like, hey, I lost 50 pounds and I was pre-diabetic and now I'm off all my medication. Like, I don't know. That wasn't my initial reason why I did it in any way. I wish I was that altruistic. I'm not. But it sort of evolved into that, and like seeing what happened to me, because I'm in the film, and kind of seeing what happened to me in terms of what I went through, and then realizing, wait a minute, like this could help people. Like people are going to hear this. Like it might literally change people's lives. But I mean, for you to get this, the most pointed, like, hey, I was going to end my life and I saw your film and I didn't. I again, there's like magnification of like, I can't even imagine what that is. I mean, obviously for this person, like it saved their life, but for you to know, like, I went through all of this and here we are, 30 years later, and what I went through saved somebody's life. I mean, can you even put into words what what that feels like?
It's very humbling, to say the least. It's I'm trying not to cry, but it's like moments like that. And I apologize to your audience if you think this is out of line or a little too much, but it's moments like that you kind of go, it was all worth it. Or at the very least, at least it makes sense. You know what I mean? Because that I just attribute to my mother. You know what I mean? And yeah, of course, what I went through is horrible too. But the loss of my mother and her life and her positive impact she had in the world, and her light being snuffed out by a literal monster, is that's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, that there's like a little bit of a redemption story there to it. It's those are the things I think that any filmmaker, any creative period ever, that's what they aspire to, right? They aspire for their work to be able to make a difference and an impact on the world. it's like I made the film, traveling around the world with it. I do like a TED talk. I'm on Dr. Phil, and then I do this podcast. I started like 2022, and then I'm meeting all these people, and I'm sharing these stories. I get all this just all every day. Every day I get these messages, and it's wild, and it's so humbling, and it just makes me go, oh, okay, this is great, but it's again, it just makes it all worth it. And I had no idea. I was like, if one person is impacted, if it helps one person, it's worth it. And it helps me sort of process my process, but I think every filmmaker, every creative wants that, like that legacy, you know what I mean? Like that legacy that lives on, that serves a bigger purpose. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, I made a movie, I made the Avengers and I made $1 billion. But that would be awesome too. But I think the bigger impact is the impact on humanity, that when people see this, they go, it still resonates with them. The film's been out, like 6 years now. It came out, on all the streaming services during the pandemic, like in 2021. So like it really hit the airwaves, I suppose. So it, for your work to sort of solidify you in the annals of history. And also, the sort of feather in my cap to that is being able to sit down with my father and put his feet to the fire in the prison and plead with him too. It was a plea for humanity of just admit that you did this so everyone can move on. And I read him a letter, spoiler alert, but I read him a letter that I wrote when I was 13 years old, asking him to just come clean. Not only for me and for the family and for his daughter who was born 12 days before he was arrested, and all these people, the girlfriend, everyone, but for himself too, so that he can begin to heal. And the fact that I wrote that letter when I was 13 was, and I read it for the first time since I had written it in the film to him. It's like, just be honest, man. Just, I got a tattoo on my arm. It's a David Foster Wallace quote. It's the truth will set you free, but not until it is finished with you. And that was that's the thing, is sitting there and telling him this and just pleading for him to just, for his life, but to put that in the annals of history felt pretty good.
Yeah. And there's a couple things in there. Number one, like you said, he didn't know what the purpose of you making the film was. And I'm assuming he's figured it out at this point. And you said you have not talked to him.
Maybe he has. I still wonder that, after having sat across from him recently. Like, you do. I just had him on a podcast I did with Sony. He interviewed for 2 days.
So you have talked to him?
No, but I didn't interview him for that show. I got him one that, I had him. I developed that in partnership with Sony and Orbit Media. And, but yeah, he was on the podcast. It was wild.
So you haven't talked to him since...
No, I have spoken to him. No, I just sat down in front of him recently. Yeah. But I don't know if he's fully aware. Everybody, when I walked into that prison, knew who I was. They're like, oh yeah, you're the guy that made the film. They weren't too... look, I am most certainly not on the Ohio Department of Corrections, the Rehabilitation and Corrections Christmas card list. That's for sure. Because they were pissed when we made that, because look, I had to, look, the film is made by Barbara Koppel. If you don't know who she is, she's won 2 Academy Awards for documentaries. She is an amazing, she's arguably one of the greatest documentarians of all time. And she, we were in the prison and I pitched them. I'm the one that got us in the prison. And I told them, I was like, look, it'll be great. My father will sit down. I'll ask him. He'll admit to what happened and he'll tell me his side of the story. And it'll be this big come to Jesus moment. And it'll be so amazing. And it'll be great for the rehabilitation for the department, all this stuff. And they were like, yeah, they I think I met with them on a Thursday and they got back to us on a Monday and we're like, yeah, we'll give you the green light. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. What I didn't tell them is like, yeah, he's probably not going to say that. And he's probably not going to be able to do that, but it might happen. And of course it doesn't. But I mean, well, that they gave us that hour, and I remember at the end of the hour, just hear, hearing the woman who was in charge just took my producer, my little producer, Ray Novoselsky, God bless him, into this concrete room and was screaming, and we could hear everything she was saying. What was that? What did he lie to us? He blah, 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 blah. Oh, she was so mad. But it's like, look, I gave my father every opportunity to tell the truth. I gave him I was a good son. I was a good son to my mother, and I was a good son to my father. I gave him the opportunity. It's all you can ever give anybody. There's your opportunity.
How is he with you now?
It's very odd. And I, you asked this earlier, and it's one of those things where it's like, is he like this because has he just always been like this? Probably. And I'm just more aware of it, or now I'm hyper aware of it. I went from being a filmmaker I still make films, and I still work for people, and I still shoot a lot of stuff. But it's like I went from only doing that to like now I develop content around my story and around the film and then around others. And I talk to other people about trauma and, all that stuff. And, that's how I relate to the world, right? By sharing my story, which I wasn't doing at that time that I last saw him or when I was making the film. I mean, I guess that was the very start of it, the genesis of it, if you will. But, yeah, it's very hard to have a parent that's a psychopath. Everything is disingenuous.
Is there a world where he makes parole this year? He gives you a call. Hey, you want to grab coffee at Starbucks? I mean, is that happening?
I sure hope not. But look, I put it up into the fate's hands. I say what I have to say, and I feel how I feel. And if come what may,
If he was willing to take the rap, do you think it would change how you feel about what his future should be?
No. And I don't think that, that's magical thinking. That'll never happen because it'll be so contrived. It'll just be for that reason. But I've already made peace with that. There's nothing that he could, say or do that is going to make up for like 35 years of bullshit. You know what I mean? Or longer than that, really, because I lived with him too.
Right.
Nothing is going to make up for that. He's not, you can't rewrite history. You know what I mean? And I think that, again, this is one of the things I think that gets lost in the story, and it does get lost in the film. I think just because maybe people aren't paying attention because there's so much information and there's so much that's like you're watching my experience unfold in front of the camera. But one of the things that people don't understand is this is a premeditated crime. This wasn't like my father. They got into a fight, as he tries to put it. He pushed her. She hit her head. This is not an accident. This was premeditated. He asked about lowering the floor in the house months beforehand. He rented a jackhammer 3 days before her murder to dig the hole. He bought the indoor-outdoor carpeting. He bought the tarp that she was wrapped in with me at Kmart months before that. The indoor-outdoor carpeting was sitting on our back porch. I mean, there was a whole, this is a premeditated murder. You know what I mean? Which is what makes it, so horrific. And so insidious. It's not like this was just a crime of passion, which, that would be a different story. If he's like, look, I didn't mean to pull the trigger. I don't know what came over me, and I instantly regretted it. He talks about in the film of like giving her CPR, doctor giving her CPR. Like he didn't call 911. He didn't do it's so absurd. I mean, when people watch the film, I ask them all these questions, and it's like, then you show the evidence next to it, and it's just like, but nobody realizes, everybody realizes it, but him. That's what's staggering.
Yeah.
Everybody knows it's bullshit, but him. I mean, I guess you have to believe it to live it. I don't know. Yeah.
And I think the interesting part we brought up earlier about, just creating art. And I think that, when you talk about, oh yeah, I made Avengers and I made $1 billion, or, um, the other end, I think there are plenty of artists out there who make art and don't care if anybody ever sees it, or at
Sure.
least that's what they say in interviews. I mean,
Yeah.
especially on the music side. I mean, you've heard that so many times. I write music. I don't care if anybody listens to it. I don't care if anybody likes it. And the fact that all these people like it, great. Um, and then there's something, in the middle,
Yeah.
or there's a lot in the middle, I should say.
Yeah.
And I think that, what you're doing to help people and, to put your story out there, and, presumably it's not something you had to do. You had already found the path. You were already working. I mean, like you said, you were working in television. You didn't necessarily need to do this for any other reason than you felt like you needed to do it. Um, it's, I mean, that's, to even have the opportunity to make art for that reason is a pretty cool thing.
And, we didn't really get into like how it all happened, but I basically I would work on sets for free. I remember I met somebody through Craigslist, and they said, he was in lighting, and he's like, you can come down and work on the set for free. You get free lunch, but you'll work on a union set, So I was like on the set of The Social Network, like doing shit, I was not an IATSE. I was not, but I was like, wait, I can film things with a camera and make that into a career. I can be a cinematographer. I was aware of what they did, and I was an actor in front of the camera before. So it was like, okay, I can do that. But one of the things I got lost in this is the film that really impacted me, in my world was I saw a film in 1998 called American History X, where Edward Norton plays a neo-Nazi. And it's a fantastic film. It's probably my top 5 American films of all time. And I came out of the theater with a friend of mine who was Black, and we were discussing the impacts of the racial violence in it and stuff, because that's what it's about. And it's, and the consequences of said violence. And I said, man, who ever made that film really understands the consequences of violence? Flash forward 10 years later, John Morsey, the sole producer of that film, comes into my life, walks into my house, and we become friends, and we are still friends to this day. And I told him, after a couple of years, I gave him a book of newspaper articles because he was talking about something. I said, I got a project I really want to do. And the next day, I gave him this book of newspaper articles. And the next day he calls me, he goes, holy shit, man, this is your life. And I said, yep. I said, I want to do something with it. And he goes, I know somebody I made a movie with. She won 2 Oscars for documentaries. Her name is Barbara Koppel. Let's see if she's interested. And then the rest was history, I suppose.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So let our viewers know, if they haven't yet, where they can find this and find you.
Sure. So you can find the film A Murder in Mansfield on, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Discovery Plus. You can find it on my website. You can go to collierlandry.com. My store link is on there, and my link in bio stuff. You can find me on all platforms at Collier Landry, CollierLandry. You can find my latest podcast, Finding Mom's Killer, out on The Binge from Sony Music, wherever you get your podcast from. And you can find my show on YouTube and on Apple and Spotify platforms. And that is the Collier Landry Show. It used to be called Moving Past Murder. Then was Moving Past Trauma, but it's a mental health podcast. And I talked about true crime for a while. I sort of put that aside, and now I'm focusing on the mental health aspects of trauma and ways to move past that and get your life together and learn from my experience and my mistakes too. So that's what I share.
Awesome. Collier, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.